The old man who bought a junk car and everyone made fun of him for it. But no one knew the true story. Today we take you on a journey to a time and a country where it was not natural for everyone to own a car. Don Ismail and his daughter dreamed of owning a car all their lives, but it would take decades until this dream finally came true. The dream of owning a car. Don Ismail was a kind-hearted man who lived in the countryside. He lived all alone and had brought it to modest prosperity. His greatest dream was to buy his own car right after the terrible world wars and use it to explore his country. But that turned out to be not so easy. The country experienced severe upheavals. First came the communists, then a military coup, and finally an economic crisis. Cars for the normal rural population were considered a luxury and unnecessary frills. In addition to the bad economic situation, a completely different surprise intervened for Don. Don Ismail was already well over 50 when he fell in love with his new housekeeper. He married Doña Carmen, and although his wife was also in her mid-40s, they had another son and daughter. Due to the cost of his family and the economic difficulties in his country, Don Ismail lost much of his wealth. The family made ends meet, but the dreams of owning a car seemed increasingly out of reach for the aging Don Ismail. The children of the two turned out to be very different. The son did not get along very well with his father, often calling him a dreamer or unrealistic. He was highly critical of his country's harsh military policies and soon left home. He had only sporadic contact with his parents throughout his life. His daughter, Donna Carmela, was quite different. The daughter took after her father. She loved the stories about driving that her father told. Sometimes they would sit together on the family's old rundown tractor. Don Ismail would take his daughter on imaginative drives in a pretend car. The father told his daughter about how one day, when times were better again, they would go to the sea together. But it was not to be. Don Ismail died without ever having owned a car. Dreams never die. Carmela was inconsolable over the loss of her father. It hurt her soul that her car enthusiast father had never owned his own car. Don Ismail had left her a small sum of money. Ismail had wished on his deathbed that his daughter should buy her own car someday. Carmela guarded the money like a treasure, and whenever she had a small sum left over, she put it in the money box she had received from her father. Carmela found a lovely man named Miguel, and they got married. What a coincidence that her husband was as car crazy as her father. Miguel could drive, but he didn't have his own car either. Had the two had children, the money they had saved would very likely have been used on that. But Carmela and Miguel remained childless. The two lived happily together for years. Unfortunately, their economic situation was still not very good. Here and there, Carmela had spent money from the savings on repairs for the house. Then she got sick and paid some medical bills. It was like a jinx. Whenever Carmela and Miguel had saved money, a big expense would come up and the contents of the box were quickly gone. So the dream of owning a car was always far away. Miguel was heartbroken when the two received a devastating diagnosis. Carmela had developed a particularly malignant cancer and had only a few weeks to live. Miguel tried everything to find a car. He still wanted to fulfill this great wish of his wife's life. Once he had borrowed a car of a well-known landowner and had driven a few kilometers to see Carmela. In the remote countryside, cars were still a rarity. The few cars that were there were guarded like treasures. There were no car dealers and no car rentals. And soon, Carmela was gone, and Miguel was on his own. In the years to come, he often looked into the box where the savings for the car had been placed. When he finally stopped working and received a modest pension, he made a decision. He packed a few things and headed out. Now he would take a bus all the way to the capital and search for a cheap car until he found one. Everyone laughed at the traveling teapot. Miguel went and found every used car dealer in the big city, but even the oldest cars still far exceeded his modest budget. Meanwhile, word of the man's search seemed to have spread around town. One day, he was walking into the yard of a car dealer when someone approached him. The excited man told Miguel that he didn't have a suitable car for him either, but he knew where he could find one. The perplexed Miguel was amazed and pleased that the man offered to take him to the car. The two stopped at a junkyard outside of the city gates. There was indeed a car there that fell into Miguel's meager budget. It looked terrible. The body was dented and the thing rattled. But the engine was still running. The car was very old and had obviously been in an accident. But Miguel grabbed it. He bought the car and drove it the long distance back to his home village. As Miguel drove the old shabby car over the stony roads, people laughed at him. No one had known that this car had been his wife's dream and her father's dream. Everyone thought Miguel had just gone a little crazy. When he came around the corner with his car, the young people shouted at him. Then he was on the road again with his rickety teapot. A strange surprise. Miguel had put a picture of his wife next to him on the passenger seat. When he drove his rickety teapot over the dusty roads, he talked to Carmela in his mind and was content. One day, the old man got an unbelievable surprise. At his door stood a fine man who wanted to speak to him. The gentleman knew Miguel's name and was from the city. He introduced himself as Federico and explained that he was the owner of a car dealership. He said that many weeks ago, he had been told the story of a crazy man from the countryside who wanted to buy a used car with a few pesos in an old box, so that he and his wife could go to the sea. Miguel had actually told his story to curious used car dealers here and there. Many wanted to know why he wanted to buy a car so badly when he had hardly any money. Then he told them about Carmela and her big dream. Somehow the story had made the rounds and reached Federico. The car dealer told Miguel a very similar story. He told how his father had saved every peso so he could go to the city and get a real education. Federico went on to tell how he now owned a car dealership thanks to his father's steadfastness. Miguel's story had gone to Federico's heart, and that's when he had an idea. A bright red Audi for Miguel. Federico surprised Miguel with a wonderful car, a bright red Audi. Not brand new anymore, but compared to the rattling teapot, a true luxury vehicle. Federico wanted to give the Audi to Miguel and his wife. The car had been an old advertising car for his dealership, with the company's name printed on the sides. In return, Miguel and Carmela would do some advertising for Federico on their trips to the sea and elsewhere. The car dealer was deeply touched when he learned the truth. Miguel had never told the curious people that he wanted to fulfill his dead wife's wish. He always spoke of her as if she was still there. Federico patted Miguel's shoulder sympathetically. He still wanted to give him the car. The old man was overjoyed. He had really not expected this. Only a week later, Miguel set off. He packed a small bag, threw it in the back seat of the bright red car, placed Carmela's picture next to him in the passenger seat, and off he went. After a full 5.5 hours, Miguel stood by the sea for the first time in his life. He sighed. He held Carmela's framed portrait lovingly in his arms. Miguel said a blessing for his wife, his father-in-law, Don Ismael, and Federico. Then he sat on the wall and looked at the sea for a long time. Whenever his pension had built up so that he could buy some gasoline, Miguel set out for another tour. Carmela's picture always went along, of course. A beautiful story, isn't it? Sometimes it takes time for dreams to come true. Fate can take very strange paths and also bring us losses. Would you act similarly to Miguel and try to make the dream of a deceased family member come true? Or do you think such sentimentalities are pointless? Let us know and share your opinion and experience with us in the comments. I am curious.